Welcome to the History Book Buffs. My name's Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and journalist, and I'm one half of the Buffs. The other half is Roger Moorhouse, the best-selling writer and historian. Our book this time is The CIA Book Club by Charlie English, the brilliant story of how the CIA smuggled millions of books across the Iron Curtain in a bid to bring down the Soviet Empire. And we're going to ask the question, was it really books that beat the Soviets? Hello, Roger.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Excellent.
You bought something this week, didn't you? You sent me a picture of it. Tell me about it.
Oh, yes, I bought a bayonet.
Of course you did.
Yeah, I was bored and on the internet
Mm.
as one is,
Mm.
and I have I have some weaponry in my shed.
Mm. Your writing shed.
My
I should
writing
say.
shed, exactly. And I've sort of long had half an eye on a German World War One bayonet.
Of course.
I mean, as has everybody, right?
Yeah, always half an eye on.
So I finally took the plunge and I ordered one, and I have to say, it's a thoroughly splendid thing. It really is. So,
How much do you love it?
I do love it quite a lot. I actually got it off the wall this morning to play with it a bit.
Of course you did.
Yeah, to sort of put it back in and out of it, and to wave it around. Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted for you.
Yeah, I'm very
Congratulations.
excited about it, actually. I'm genuinely excited about it. Yeah.
Good. Well, we should move on from talking about your, being bored on the internet.
Purchases.
Oh, let's talk about this week's book.
Yes, Charlie English, the CIA Book Club, which I think it was much more of a shared fascination, I suppose. It's not like one or other of us has agitated for this one. It was one that I think we both had.
No,
on
we
the
both
radar.
loved this one. Shall I give a quick précis?
Go on then. Yeah.
So the CIA Book Club is basically the story of a CIA operation which began in 1951 to smuggle words behind the Iron Curtain, and there were huge, disparate type of words. There was everything from George Orwell to Marie Claire, and they, over the course of the lifetime of the project, which was run from a sort of insalubrious office building in Manhattan, they smuggled some 10 million titles across the Iron Curtain.
Which is huge. I mean, it was in operation for what, 40 years?
Yeah, from 1951 to 1991.
Yeah.
So I'm doing the maths.
That's 2.5 million per decade.
Yeah. I was still in 91 minus 51 maths, but sure, you carry on. So it was an incredible operation, but the book is wider in scope than that, although it does largely concentrate on Poland for reasons which we'll discuss. The book also discusses the hugely vibrant underground publishing industry in Poland during the Soviet period and the role that played. And obviously it talks about the links between the underground publishers and the CIA and where the money came from. Not always in the detail I was like, but maybe we can talk about that later as well. And it talks a lot about the collapse of the Soviet Union and how much of a part that this flood of unregulated, uncensored literature played in the destruction of a totalitarian regime.
Yes.
And I think we both found it completely fascinating for lots of different reasons, actually. Why don't you start? Why did you like it?
I would just one thing by way of introduction again. I think it's quite interesting because you said it's mainly about Poland, and I think it is probably 80, even more % about Poland. And it does say that the scheme kind of ran elsewhere as well, across Eastern Europe and even into the Soviet Union. But they found Poland to be a particularly sort of receptive audience, and that there's probably a lot in there. I think there was that sort of Polish cussedness, which is, goes back. Obviously, it's historically it's predicated on their history, the long years of partition and foreign occupation and so on. I think there was an inbuilt suspicion of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century that occupied Poland, which there isn't necessarily elsewhere. There's also a very strong literary tradition in Poland. You go back to Mickiewicz and Słowacki and the all great Polish authors of the 19th century and beyond. So there's all sorts of reasons why Poland kind of was particularly receptive to this scheme. But what I think was interesting about the book itself, just to come back to that, it doesn't mention Poland on the cover. And I've said this in a different forum. I think I did the same thing with my last book, which was about a Polish, a rescue scheme during the Holocaust. Didn't mention Poland on the cover, and neither does this. And I think it's a way, in a sense, it's a way of sort of smuggling Polish history in through the back door, if you like. So I think there's Poland perhaps has a sort of a perception problem or a marketing problem that, too many people will look at the bookshelf and Waterstones and say, oh, that's about Poland. I'm not interested in Poland. So it's a way of sort of smuggling that content in through the back door. You talk about the CIA, you talk about the Cold War. Actually, 80% of it is about Poland. And in that respect, I think it's absolutely right, because Poland is completely central in that late run-up to the final collapse of the communist systems in Eastern Europe in 1989. Hungary had its revolt in 1956. The Czechs had their revolt in 1968. And then the Poles, there was an initial sort of flourishing of resistance in the 1970s. KOR, it was known as. And then solidarity in the 80s, and through the 80s you've got martial law in 1980, of course, and then it carries on. So it really focuses in on that period, and it is fascinating that it shows you. There's a great quote from Adam Michnik.
Yeah, everybody has picked up that quote.
Yeah,
it's such a good quote.
Yeah, there's the wonderful quote where he talks about books as I think he describes it as a reservoir of humanity.
Yeah.
In the face of this, of a totalitarian system like they had, and that significance of the written word and the freedom that it brought with it, and that I think is really significant. But at the same time, we shouldn't overlook the fact that, as there's another quote from Michnik in there, where he says, the really instrumental change that had to come ultimately came from the Soviet Union, and it was Gorbachev. That was where the sort of the shackles are released. So you've got all of that change on the ground, which is really interesting, and it's told really well in the book. But what enables 89 is that seismic shift in Moscow.
Okay, there's quite a lot to unpick in that. One thing I would say is I completely agree with you about the difficulty of getting away Polish history, because, I wrote a novel about the Polish deportations, and all the feedback, it didn't get published. And part of the reason why the feedback I was getting from the publishers was great story, well told.
Yeah.
But we don't know how to sell this.
Yeah.
If it had been a story about Italy during the war, or France during the war, or Greece during the war, not a problem.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. And I don't blame the publishers necessarily, because they are capitalists. They go where the market is. And I don't know why there is a resistance to Polish history amongst English readers, because Polish history is unbelievably rich and fast. I mean, it's a slightly ridiculous conversation. I know, you're Roger. You are, a top Nazi historian, but also a historian of Poland as well. So this is your area.
Yeah.
But it's easier. In your own world, it's easier to get stuff away about the Nazis than about the Poles, right?
Yeah.
It's just.
Yeah. And it is crazy, and I always rail against this, because there's so much that Polish history teaches us about the two neighbouring countries, whether that's Russia and the Soviet guys or Germany and the Nazi guys, whatever it is. But because of their experience of living with those two neighbours, there's a hell of a lot in the Polish experience which informs us about those two neighbouring regimes, whatever they are and whatever guys they are.
So we think that Charlie English has written a fabulous book, but it's really a book about Poland that's wrapped up in a book about the CIA. But
essentially, yeah,
I'd agree with that.
that's not a criticism at all. It's a great book, and he's obviously done the hard yards. He's done the research. He's spoken to, the great thing about the material he's talking about from the 1980s is that almost all of those protagonists that he's talking about are still alive, and he can interview them. People like Michnik and Chojnacki and so on.
And also, I guess because he, just in terms of how you write a book, the CIA guys involved in these operations are not the CIA guys who are running around with bazookas. These are guys, these are anonymous bureaucrats sitting in an office, and it's slightly less interesting material than the underground publishers who he also talks about, who are, there's one character he follows through. Roger, you're going to hate me. I can't pronounce any of these names, having just wanged on about how much I love Polish history. Literally, Polish names are my nemesis.
Right.
The underground publisher who
Chojnacki.
Okay, but it's spelled like with a C.
Yeah, that's the.
Okay.
Yeah, Chojnacki.
Okay, so he follows Chojnacki, and Chojnacki is a fascinating figure because he is a young man whose parents both fought in the resistance against the Nazis.
Yeah, I think
his mother was in the Warsaw Rising.
I think it was his mother also was part of the group that killed Franz Kuchera, which was one of the most outstanding assassination plots of successful assassination of World War II. So Kuchera was the SS chief of Warsaw, so really senior guy, and he was basically stopped on the streets of Warsaw by an assassination team and machine gunned, and most of the team that hit him were killed in the aftermath. So if she was, involved in that, it's quite an astonishing claim to fame. Really
right,
is.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And then decades later, her son is fighting his own war against totalitarianism through the underground publications that he's printing. And his father, who was also a resistance fighter, says to him, do you really think this silly thing you're doing with words is going to make a difference? And he says, well, what would you rather I did? Get a gun. This is going to work. Shoot someone. Yeah. But he suffers for it in obviously a way that the CIA bureaucrats don't do. There's a scene in the book where he is arrested, and he's arrested many times, but he goes on hunger strike. And Charlie English's description of him being force-fed was quite unsparing.
Yes, it's a little bit visceral, isn't it?
Yeah. Certainly put me off my porridge. So that was incredible. He was incredible, so brave.
Yeah. It's an interesting point because solidarity, the whole point of solidarity was one of, I wouldn't say even passive resistance because that sounds a bit too kind of wishy-washy, but it's peaceful resistance. It was the idea of setting up an independent trade union. Essentially, that's where the origins of it came from, from the Gdansk shipyards. But it was supposed to be non-violent because you knew, and there's so many chapters in Polish history of these kind of doomed military risings or paramilitary risings against foreign rule, usually Russian rule. Which they start off optimistically, but they all end in disaster and bloodshed and people strung up from the barricades sort of thing. So to a large extent, solidarity is a rejection of that tradition. It sits within that tradition, but it's also a rejection of the violence of it. And through the 80s, interestingly, so that the Polish communist regime under Jaruzelski, if everyone remembers Jaruzelski, or my age, I wouldn't necessarily lump you in with my age there, Antonia. But you remember the guy with the sunglasses, and giving these dreadful pronouncements on Polish TV. He incidentally was wearing sunglasses because he was snowblind from having been in Siberia as a child.
Really?
So he was deported to Siberia as a child in 1940.
And
he was snowblind as the experience. So actually Jaruzelski is a really interesting person because although he was the figurehead of the oppression, in a sense, he was also, to some extent, and I think this is still disputed, but to some extent he was the one also that was saying, don't send the tanks in to Moscow, I'll deal with this. because he wanted to deal with it in a relatively peaceful way. So he sets up the martial law in the early 80s, and then you've got this sort of Mexican standoff effectively between the regime and Solidarity, for most of the 80s. So that's where the core of this book comes in.
Yeah.
With the outside CIA and outside forces kind of pumping this stuff in. And again, like you say, whether it was Solzhenitsyn or just kind of European literature. I mean, we didn't necessarily have to have
or
political
fashion
content.
Magazines.
Fashion magazines as well. So it was just a sort of outside content. Was hugely influential in that sense in terms of keeping the dream alive and keeping Poland feeling like, for ordinary Poles, feeling like they are part of the world cultural mainstream.
Isn't it more than that, though? Because all authoritarian regimes rely to a certain extent on manipulating and controlling the narrative.
Mm.
And what the underground publishers with CIA backing were doing was creating a multiplicity of narratives. And once there are uncontrollable versions of the world out there, as an authoritarian regime, it's very difficult then to create the conditions to hold power, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. I think our assumption when we talk about totalitarian regimes is that they rely for their own maintenance on violence and the threat of violence. And that's not necessarily the case when you look at them. It's about seduction in the first instance, and then control. It's about control, often through non-violent means. And this is part of that. Controlling the narrative is one very vital way of doing that. And it's a really interesting angle of this as well is that you mentioned Chojnacki and his hunger strike and so on, how the regime did still have teeth in the 1980s. And again, it's another assumption, I think, that we imagine that the communist regimes in the 1980s were so exhausted and sclerotic that they no longer could kind of reach the sort of hideous depths of oppression that they had maybe 30 years earlier in the 50s, because they all had that sort of Stalinist spasm as well in the late 40s and early 50s. But they kind of stopped doing that. But then there's a great example in the book which he gives detail to, which is the famous the kidnapping and murder of the Solidarity priest Jerzy Popiełuszko, which was a huge thing at the time. 1984, was kidnapped by a couple of members of the Communist Security Service, and basically beaten up and left in a reservoir and drowned. So murdered by the regime. And I mean, for historians anyway, it's certainly proof that the regime still had teeth. That they still could do that if they wanted. It was nowhere near, exhausted in that sense. So it's still risky what they were doing.
And they were trying to control what people read, what people watched, what people listened to, right till the very end. Because without that control, they had nothing. And as Charlie English points out, both of us have been to a number of former state security buildings in the former Soviet Union. The equipment there from the 80s, they were still listening and watching and going after people. They weren't necessarily shooting them in the head like the NKVD were, but they were certainly, this was not a low impact activity.
No, absolutely not. And that does come across, I think he actually pitches that, about right in terms of, the degree of sort of oppression and degree of threat that was there. Because for those involved in, the Polish end of this operation, there was genuine threat to life involved.
The other interesting point that he makes, which I really enjoyed reading, was that within the CIA itself, this was not considered a particularly prestigious or important operation. Yeah. It was very low budget. That
it was decidedly unsexy.
Yeah. And then in the 80s, they were spaffing, in fact, vast quantities of money sort of on covert ops in Afghanistan and whatever. And so the narrative within the CIA became about those ops, the expensive ones, the glamour ones, the ones which involve blowing things up. And this operation was underestimated and underplayed. But Charlie English makes the claim that this operation, which diluted the Soviet ability to control people's mind, was infinitely as important, if not more so, in the collapse of the Soviet Empire than anything the CIA did running around in Afghanistan. I mean, what do you think of that argument?
I sort of alluded to that before. I mean, that we forget collectively when we talk about 89, we in the West forget how significant Poland's role was in that. Because the West has this sort of obsession with Berlin and the Berlin Wall, we think, anyone that thinks about it, you'll say 1989, oh, that's when the Berlin Wall fell.
Yeah.
Right, that's the headline act. That was, to a large extent, was almost the last act of the drama. The drama sort of has a much longer tail, and it goes way back, as we said before, to 56 and to 68, and then to Solidarity in the early 80s and so on, Lech Wałęsa. But the Polish element in that final phase is huge.
It's the first domino, right?
It's the first domino, absolutely. And you can't really see the collapse in 89 without that Polish contribution, because they were the sort of the thorn in the side that demanded an answer, demanded a solution from Moscow, and with the advent of Gorbachev, the answer was not going to be sending the tanks in again. It had to be something else, and then the answer is to sort of loosen the repression, as they do in Poland. So Poland has free elections in the early summer of 1989, again, as he describes in the book, has free elections, semi-free elections, let's call it. Even within the restrictions of that semi-free election, it's a landslide for Solidarity. So the communists are going, well, this is unreformable. So we can't send the tanks in. We can't reform. Basically we're screwed. And that's when they realize that the game's up. So the significance of Poland in that wider narrative that ends up with the fall of the Berlin Wall is huge.
Yeah. But then that hasn't quite got to the meat of then how important it was for okay, so Poland's the first domino, but for the first domino to fall, how important is it that there are all these underground presses? There's these, he talks a lot about a Polish underground magazine called Kultura, which is financed by the CIA, which is a kind of alternative news source and kind of source of kind of Polish.
Which ran out of Paris and was culturally very, very influential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, or is it even completely pointless us trying to use this, like pull this one strand and say this was the one that matters? It's a bit like an A-level question, isn't it? Rank these reasons for the collapse of the Polish authoritarian regime in order of importance. I mean, in one sense, it's sort of, stupid. But
yeah. I mean, I think it has a vital contribution in sort of spurring that, I think I've used the word before, that cussedness of the Poles that is, is kind of a historic thing, but particularly by the 80s. I mean, Poland, communism across Eastern Europe, by the 80s, it's in a protracted crisis of legitimation. So it legitimized itself, first of all, through force, through liberation. It liberated Eastern Europe, liberation in inverted commas, from the Nazis, won the war. Then it's sort of social and economic progress, which works up to a point, maybe even to the 70s. And then you've got that great stagnation. By that stage, there's not much left to legitimate it. It doesn't work on ideological grounds because nobody believes anymore. It doesn't work on material grounds because it's no longer functioning, providing a decent standard of living and the rest of it. So it's communism is washed up. All it's got is brute force. And when Gorbachev comes, then brute force is off the table.
But that only matters in one sense if the people within those regimes can see the alternative vision, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't know, that's one of the reasons why they're sending fashion magazines, not just Solzhenitsyn, right?
Yes.
Because if you don't know that there is an alternative vision outside, because you're constantly being bombarded with messages that the West is decadent, the West is corrupt, the West is this and that and the other. So so there's still something quite important about
I
the
absolutely agree.
alternative vision
I
that's
agree.
being
And
offered.
I'm wary of the slightly kind of wilder claim, which I think he sort of alludes to quite carefully, but just saying that this was absolutely the thing. I think it's one of a smorgasbord of influences.
If you're writing a book about something, you have
course.
to make a claim for its importance that's potentially slightly inflated.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's inflated, actually. I mean, I take your point 100% that there are huge amounts of other things, but I think that what the book very strongly makes the case for, which I found incredibly powerful and inspiring, is the power of words and the truth to create a sense within people's mind that freedom is possible and that freedom is desirable. Because without the kind of existence of great literature and great art, then why not be enslaved? Like these are things that make us human. And if you want to be a free human, part of that is having access to great minds. There's the guy who wrote the Cultura, who was in charge of the Cultura operation. Gidra. Yeah, him. He said, that he would just send everything. He didn't really care, like, he said something about, he's not worried about the kind of politics or the morals of the words that he's sending in one sense, because, people can work that out for themselves. Like, in a way, I guess it's what we now call this slightly annoying internet term, the marketplace of ideas. But, once people have access to kind of free thought, then stuff happens, stuff changes, people make a difference. Some, not always for the better. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to be naive about it. But what was inspiring about the book is if you take a kind of sort of literate population like the Poles, who are thirsty for knowledge and thirsty for truth and thirsty for a version of the history that has been denied them and manipulated, then you create something quite special.
And I think that's an important part of it as well, is that, the Poles saw themselves particularly with their Catholicism, and their rich history. I mean, wasn't like Czechoslovakia, which sort of appeared in 1918. The Poles have a long history going way back.
Movable borders,
of course, but it's still, it's a long history. So they saw themselves as part of a European cultural mainstream, and then they've been cut off from that after 45 by being, taken into the Soviet sphere. So there is a thirst for, some sort of recognition that the outside world, first of all, hasn't forgotten about them, which is one thing that is a peculiarly Polish sort of neurosis, and also that this is recognition that they're still part of that mainstream, and that, as you said, we've got that. The alternative is a sort of this rather claustrophobic and sort of tightly controlled intellectual sphere that you had in the Soviet Union, when the alternative is the mass of Western civilization, whether it, as you said, whether it's Orwell or Solzhenitsyn or Marie Claire, that is tremendously heady stuff to a Polish mind, for all the reasons, not necessarily even intellectual ones, but just to feel like the outside world has not forgotten you.
I love the way you keep saying Marie Claire. Like, is that the only fashion magazine you know?
I think it might.
Have you got all the back catalogue?
Yeah. Another thing that I collect.
Yeah, it sits alongside your German bayonets. Listen, I think we should move on from the CIA Book Club to books inspired by the CIA Book Club, because we, as we've made quite clear, I think we both really enjoyed it, and good. It made me revisit and rethink about some titles, and I know it did you too. So
yes, indeed.
Why don't you kick us off? What's your first book that you think people who...
I was cast back. 89 has a particular resonance with me because it was, I don't think it's too, pompous to describe it as sort of part of my own intellectual awakening
Okay, that
could
is
we
quite
say?
pompous.
Was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
but it's okay. Carry
Well,
on.
we can edit that out.
No, I'm keeping that. I want everybody to know about your intellectual
But
pomposity.
it was like that, you know. I mean, that I found 89, particularly the run up to 89, when it was when all of this sort of stuff was happening. I was working, and I found it fascinating. And I used to sort of hurry back from work to put the telly on, you know, with our 4 channels or whatever it was we had back in the day, to sort of catch the latest news, whatever had happened. And I found the whole thing fascinating. So when it all began to collapse, it was like sort of absolutely mesmerizing, intoxicating. And at the time, I read quite a lot of Timothy Garton Ash, who is now, you know, he's a fellow at Oxford. At the time, was a PhD student, I think, in Berlin. He went to Berlin in the 1980s to do the research for a PhD into what I think was Nazi society or German society under the Nazis, and he ended up, in a sense, being swept up in all of this. And he travelled around. He wrote occasional pieces for, I think it was The Spectator mainly, but others as well. So he ended up almost, you know, being a freelance journalist on the side. And he travelled around, and he got to know all these underground sort of resistance people. And he was in Prague, on the sidelines of sort of Havel and various other people from Charter 77 and that sort of thing. So he was kind of there on the fringes of all of this. And writing these articles, which were really interesting as sort of eyewitness accounts of the way society was just shifting underneath everybody's feet.
And is there a book?
The book is Uses of Adversity,
Okay.
Which is a collection of essays from that period.
Okay.
Really interesting, all the way from East Berlin, covering Poland and Czechoslovakia and beyond, and it really brings back that sense that the earth was just shifting on its axis in the 1980s.
That sounds brilliant. Timothy Garton Ash is actually quoted in Charlie English's book because he quotes him talking to people about George Orwell, saying, and I'm bringing this up for a reason, because they say the people within the Soviet Empire are saying to Timothy Garton Ash, how did George Orwell know? How did he know what it was like? This is what it was like. This is what it is like, rather, I should say. So the book that I want to recommend, in the incredible off chance that nobody has read it, but in fact, even if you have, is 1984.
Read it again.
Because I realised, reading Charlie English's book, I was like, oh yeah, 1984. And then I thought, my God, I was probably 15 when I read 1984. It's only a few years ago, Roger.
Of course.
But long enough ago, perhaps, that it's worth me having another look at it. So I went back, and it's just as brilliant as it, and just as sort of. And actually, let's not make this a is Trump a fascist conversation like every other conversation that anybody has at the moment. But certainly reading 1984 at the moment feels maybe a bit more resonant than it would have done had I been reading it when I was reading it in the kind of 90s, when we kind of thought
end of history,
triumph of liberal democracy, the walls come down, authoritarianism is the thing of the past.
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? George Orwell is a man of his times, not a prophet. Anyway, here we are, worth reading again.
And the other point about Orwell as well, particularly 1984, is the extent to which it still has a cultural resonance, in terms of, Room 101, Big Brother, all of this, doublethink or thought crime, and all of that comes from Orwell. And they're phrases that we and commentators use all the time now. I think in many cases not really realising where it came from, and it came from Orwell.
I think also, just as a general rule, like, it's a really good idea to reread classics when you're old, because the way you approach the world when you're 15 is very different.
Indeed.
And less wise.
A touch.
And I'm probably more cynical now than I was then. Anyway.
No bad thing.
Tell me about your next book.
I am going to go with, we mentioned Popia Wushko. I was going to mention Kevin Ruane, who was a BBC journalist in Central Europe at the time. I think he was based in I think it was based in Warsaw at the time in the 1980s. And he wrote a book called To Kill a Priest, which is about the case of the murder of Poppy Łuszko.
Yeah.
Which was a big thing. It sounds like it's kind of a small episode, but in terms of the regime, as I said, showing its teeth, and showing what it could still do if you upset it in the 1980s and 1984, ironically. It's a really sort of salient lesson. And he writes that, it's a really good account. It's really, really well constructed. And it came out probably 10 years ago, maybe a bit more. Kevin Ruane, To Kill a Priest.
Okay, sounds good.
What about you?
So my next book is, this is one of my favourite books ever. It's called Inhuman Lamb by Joseph Chapsky. You know this book. So Joseph Chapsky actually appears as a character in the CIA book club because he is friends with the guy who runs Kultura magazine.
Giedroyc.
Thank you very much. And the two of them were in the Polish army, Anders' army, that was comprised of Poles who were captured by the Soviets in 1939 and ended up in Siberia and then left
Deported
Siberia.
To Siberia. Let's not
Dress
that up.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, horribly and forcibly taken to Siberia.
There it is.
And then they came out of Siberia overland and ended up, basically, long story short, in the army controlled by General Anders, which then ended up doing great things in Italy and at Monte Cassino, etc. Now, Chapsky and
Giedroyc,
him, were pals from Anders' armies and later set up this magazine. And, that's why Chapsky's in the book. Chapsky is also the author of one of the most incredible and interesting memoirs I've ever read. So it starts when he's come out of Siberia and he was, for a time, in the prison where the officers who were murdered at Katyn were held. And after
there are a few
war,
with Katyn, but one of them. Yeah.
And after he is released from Siberia, he is basically charged with finding the officers, the missing officers. Where are they? So he takes a journey through Soviet Russia to try and track down the missing officers, and he ends up in Moscow. And he has been there before in the early days of the revolution, and some of this is a kind of, a kind of commentary on how things have changed. The thing that marks this book out, because there are obviously lots of books written about, memoirs about this time and memoirs about living through this era. The thing that marks it out is Chapsky himself and his unbelievable wisdom and his humanity.
I was going to say exactly that.
And his...
That's what comes across really strongly, isn't it? How thoughtful he is, how cultured he is.
How
sensitive,
wise and tender. I mean, it sounds like we're overdoing it. We're really, really not.
No, it's a remarkable book.
One of the conclusions he reaches is that one of the most horrific things in Soviet Russia is the abandonment of truth. And it's a society that's based on lies sponsored by the state, and that a society based on lies is corrosive to your soul and corrosive to your ability to live a human life that's, full and rewarding. And
that's where you come back to the significance.
Of
free access to literature.
And all literature. Take your pick.
Exactly.
Not all literature is true, of course, but you need to be able to pick your way through and find, a path that seems truthful, and to have state control of that path is what is most corrosive to the human soul. And that was Chapsky's conclusion when he went searching across the Soviet Union for the missing officers. So, big recommend if you haven't read that. He's also a brilliant artist, of course. I mean, that's his.
That was his thing.
Yeah. He's an artist. He's one of the most incredible characters in 20th century history, and I think he deserves.
I would agree with that. Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
Well said. Two good choices there.
Yeah. Okay, your last book, and then we need to.
The last one I was going to mention is Victor Sebastian, Revolution 1989.
Yeah.
So if you want to, look at how those dominoes fell after Poland fell, being the first domino, how that sort of that virus of freedom kind of spread through Eastern Europe, ending up with, as we know, the Berlin Wall in November of 89, and then ultimately Romania at the end at Christmas of 89. He tells it really, really beautifully and ties it all together. And as a sort of a single volume on a hugely complicated subject, it's really worth a look.
Okay, I like that. The virus of freedom. Can I catch that one?
Of course you can.
Awesome. All right, Roger. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
See you next time.